and other fundamental international legal norms. I'd like to remind you that Russia's approaches to the issues on the agenda of the 78th session of the General Assembly are reflected in more detail in the relevant material, which is available on the Ministry's website. The link will be available in the text version of the briefing. I would like to remind everyone of the official accounts of the Russian MFA on social media, almost all kinds of platforms, and we will publish expeditiously all kinds of photo and video material. And on the 25th of September, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov will take part in the opening ceremony of the exhibition dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and Egypt. The exhibition will start on September the 25th, though the anniversary is on September the 26th. In the framework of the ceremony, the exhibition will present materials of the Archive of Foreign Policy of the Russian Federation, telling about different stages of development of the multifaceted cooperation. Let's move on to international agenda and to Ukraine in particular. The Kyiv regime has not stopped committing bloody crimes against the inhabitants of the Russian regions and destroying residential houses, schools, hospitals, kindergartens, and other civilian infrastructure. For this purpose, the maximum range of NATO weapons from heavy artillery to attack drones is being used. On September the 12th, the shelling of Donetsk by Ukrainian militants caused a utility room at St. Ignatievsky Church to catch fire. On September the 17th, the Church of St. Equal to the Apostles Prince Vladimir in the city suffered damage. On the night of September the 13th, Ukrainian neo-Nazi hit the Orджоникідзе ship repair plant in Sevastopol with the cruise missiles, and houses were damaged. 24 people were injured. On September the 14th, one person was killed in Kursk region after Ukrainian shelling. The next day, Ukrainian military cynically shelled residential neighborhood in Novaya Kakhovka. A local resident was killed. 15 people were wounded. 2 multi-story houses were almost completely destroyed. On September the 16th, Ukrainian neo-Nazis launched a barbaric attack on a market in Svitodarsk. 7 people were killed. On the same day, 2 civilians were killed by shelling in Donetsk. A few years ago, gruesome footage circulated on the internet showing Ukrainian fighters chasing 2 prisoners in Russian army uniforms towards a minefield. After a while, a few soldiers though after what has been done, we can call such a person a criminal, not a soldier, opened fire in their direction, followed by an explosion. Such crimes are accompanied with inscriptions that mines are to be removed in this way. I would like to remind you that such heinous crimes were committed by the Nazis during the Great Patriotic War, and today their followers in Ukraine are diligently adopting those brutal practices of Hitlerism. Russian law enforcement authorities are already studying the videos and all the circumstances of what happened, and the information about the inhumane treatment of Russian prisoners of war is confirmed. The perpetrators will be held criminally liable. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis based on the collected evidence. They also committed serious crimes against civilians and prisoners of war. I'd like to outline some examples. Last week, a life sentence was handed down to Vladislav Kulak, a neo-Nazi who in April 2022 in Mariupol, together with other AFU fighters, prevented the free exit of civilians from the city using, among other things, firearms. In accordance with the criminal orders of his command, he shot 8 civilians. From 22 to 29 years in prisons were given to neo-Nazis of the AFU, Oleg Bezvolov, Sergei Makeyev, Mikhail Chistoplasov for the murder of civilians in Mariupol in the spring of 2022. From 26 to 29 years of strict regime colony received militants of the terrorist organization Azov Alexander Slobodinyuk, Ivan Bachkarov, Dmitry Kanupir, Ruslan Kolodyazhny for the murder of civilians in Mariupol in March-April 2022. From 14.5 to 16 years of imprisonment and absentia were appointed to the 3 militants of this organization: Vadim Gusiev, David Kasatkin, Denis Zhechkov, for violence against Russian prisoners of war last April in Mariupol. 24 years of imprisoners were given to Azov militant Anton Shtukin, who shelled the humanitarian aid delivery point in March 2022 in Mariupol district. Neo-Nazis Sahil Alakhverdiev and Alexei Borisenko were sentenced to 16 and 17 years in strict regime colony, respectively. They fired grenade launchers and mortars at residential houses in the towns of Tashkovka and Severodonetsk. The Kiev regime will not be able to escape responsibility for its heinous atrocities. Ukrainian neo-Nazis who commit crimes against the inhabitants of the Russian regions and our servicemen will certainly be held accountable before the law. Against this background, we see attempt in some Western countries to whitewash Ukrainian neo-Nazis. In Milan, in one of the streets of the city authorities allowed a photo exhibition dedicated to the Nazi battalion Azov to be organized. In it, militants from this terrorist organization are presented as defenders of Mariupol. At the same time, back in June 2015, U.S. congressman called the Azov battalion, and I quote, a disgusting Nazi formation, and banned in 2015 the Pentagon from providing it with military technical assistance and training its thugs. But everything in Washington depends on the conjuncture and the influx of money. Another egregious example is a biased article in the French. Do you remember what your countries went through during the Second World War, when you were on the verge of destruction? As for our country, it was sentenced to in slavery, in absentia, or to elimination if we hadn't agreed to be slaves of the regime. So in France, the situation was different. There was no order to eliminate it. It was just occupied, and an important part of the French society deemed it absolutely normal, and in general didn't consider it necessary to resist that, and it served those who had occupied the country. Then the French minority started to resist. That's where the notion, the French resistance, comes from. And thanks to the minority, the whole country, including the majority who had applauded those Nazis who had occupied the country, were turned into heroes. Thanks to the minority, those who risked their lives, knowing that many of them would die. In Italy, the situation was different. Italy expressed officially its solidarity with this egregious logic. That's where fascism and Nazism came from, but also due to the heroic efforts of an absolute minority who managed to change the mind of the vast majority, Italy was able to renew its existence. And only thanks to the French and Italian citizens who were conscious who had enough conscience, who knew enough about human values and humanity, and thanks to their ability to resist, France and Italy were able to live in dignity during the second half of the 20th century. And what's happening now? The same things, but I would like to remind Paris and Rome of the history of the Ukrainian nationalism, and we'll do it in detail. These countries are to know where such a permissiveness can lead, and in the near future, we expect Zelensky to go to the United States. His meeting with Joe Biden is planned. Also, he's supposed to be received in Congress. It is obvious that this beggar is once again going to ask for money and weapons from his American masters. And against the background has become clear from open sources that German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has not ruled out the possibility of a decision to supply the Ukrainian armed forces with long-range Taurus missiles. It means that Kyiv, with the help of that the West, with the help of its puppets in Kyiv, is deliberately moving towards further escalation of the conflict and remains indifferent to the suffering of the civilian population. And everything is covered with the so-called peaceful plans of Zelensky and some work groups created for us in support of this alleged peaceful plans of Zelensky. As far as I remember, for a year and a half, West spoke in favor of resolving the issues on the battlefield, and it prohibited Kyiv to think about any kinds of peaceful contacts. What is happening now? A play called peaceful plans of Zelensky and negotiations without any real conversations. In reality, a decision is going to be taken about more supplies of weapons to Ukraine. Then people shouldn't be deceived when work groups are being convened. Everyone should understand that it's about pumping more weapons into the territory of Kyiv. The former head of the so-called Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, banned in Russia, Mustafa Dzhemiliev, said in an interview with Deutsche Welle, that publishes images of extremists, Nazis who killed civilians, called such people militants and liberators, but then changed its mind and started to call them criminals and terrorists. So Dzhemiliev said in an interview that the Crimean Bridge should be eliminated. Is it okay for the Western media to publish such kinds of statement? Because civilians, the Crimeans, use this bridge, including children and women. Secretary of National Secretary and Defense Council of Ukraine, Alexei Danilov, promised to smoke the Russians out of Crimea with weapons if they do not leave on their own. And we should like to remind these Kyiv extremists that the question of Crimea is not open. It's closed by the inhabitants themselves who made their choice back in 2014 because they knew what would happen to them, because they know that they would be smoked out of the territory in all kinds of ways based on the nationalistic logic. Any attempts to encroach on the peninsula by force will receive an immediate and harsh response, as it has been done before. The other day in Kyiv, they dismantled a memorial plaque to great Russian poet Alexander Pushkin on the house where he stayed in 1821. The Kyiv authorities did not even stop, despite the inscription, despite the fact that the inscription on it was in Ukrainian. Obviously, the Banderites do not need the memory of outstanding people who lived long before the emergence of Ukraine itself, but they are very eager to install similar signs in places where the Western masters have visited, such as the McDonald's fast food restaurant where U.S. Secretary of State died last week. It's not a joke. Speaking about Banderites and memorial plaques dedicated to Banderites and Shukhevich are not even something to be reminded of, but Blinken was also honored in the same way. And it's obvious that Blinken is more important for Ukraine than Pushkin. Yes, Pushkin used its poetry to invoke kind feelings in human souls, while Blinken delivers weapons. The vast indulgence of the Kyiv regime's crimes, its continued pumping of arms to escalate the conflict and threaten Russia, makes it necessary to fully implement all the goals of the special military operation, including those that we have been trying to explain for such a long time to the West. But now everyone understands who's doing what kinds of things. And for many years we have been saying, and I would like to reiterate that there is material and drum documents that testify to the goals of the UN nationalist movements that appeared in the middle or in the first third of the 20th century in its heinous Nazi form, and it gained momentum during the Great Patriotic War and survived despite all the efforts to counter them. On the site of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are archives that testify to the crimes of the Ukrainian nationalists
committed by the members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Resurgent Army. Many just say this organization without understanding what it is about. This organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, and there is also the Ukrainian Resurgence Army, URA. You shouldn't talk about their peaceful intentions. Those are the nationalists who professed the path of war for decades. But no one understands what stands behind this organization, but we will recall what it is about. So the materials published on the ministry's website and in our web text version of the briefing, you will find a link to that. Will tell you how during the years of the World War II, how the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists committed crimes against civilians on an ethnic basis. These materials tell about their ideological followers, the Kiev regime, and they demonstrate a sad continuity of generations of Ukrainian Nazis who, over the past 100 years, have been exterminating representatives of different ethnicities: Russians, Ukrainians, Polish, Russian, Czech, Jews, Roma. I'll recall that the ideology of the organization, which was established in 1929, was nationalism, which was close to fascism, which was sweeping past Europe at that time. According to historians, researchers, for example, Western European, for example, the French researcher Alain Guérin, according to them, German security services were directly involved in the establishment of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and they trained their leaders. And it's so close to the current situation in Ukraine. These nationalist ideas reincarnated this Nazi ideas together with the symbols of those collaborators who were trained on the territory of Western Ukraine, and as well as in other states, Poland and Baltic states. Poland was training them. Poland, who has become a victim of Ukrainian nationalists during the years of World War II. Unfortunately, the decision was not taken by Polish. Others made a decision because Polish are aware of the Ukrainian nationalism. They learn it by book, and they learn it by stories told by their relatives. In NATO, in Brussels, they told them that to have a bright future, you need to forget your sad past, and then you will have a success. But they didn't tell them that it was offered to different nations for over 1,000 years, and it led to many tragedies. These historical documents prove the cooperation and the subservient position of Ukrainian nationalists to German security services. The protocols of questioning of officers of German intelligence confirmed that Stepan Bandera was recruited. It is important that the cooperation of Ukrainian nationalists with the fascist Germany had ideological and not only pragmatic, opportunistic nature. In the military doctrine of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists of 1938, you can already find precursors of future atrocities. I quote, "In the future," again, I stress, this is the document of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism, a future Ukrainian state should have a pure nationalist national composition. You shouldn't hesitate in your methods. And after that, they list ethnic groups that should be exterminated from the point of view of that Ukrainian organization of Ukrainian nationalists. And you can find the Polish, Russians, and Jews. But they call them Jews in a derogatory way in this document. That's why this ideology has manifested later in horrific historic realities like Volhynian massacre. We talked about it several times, and we will provide links in our text of the briefing. Later, when the war spilled over to Poland, Ukrainian nationalists played an active role in organizing espionage and acts of sabotage, and they carried out repressions against Polish civilians. You can find all these facts in the materials that we are going to publish on the ministry's website. As for the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, there Ukrainian nationalism was never supported, and members of the organization were really outraged about it, and they called residents of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, I quote, that's how they called them, sub-Ukrainians. I think it sounds quite familiar, like those who are not jumping are Moscows. This is quite the same. If you haven't shown the Nazi salute, if you are not loyal to the Nazi regime, you are subhumans. Zelensky said beings, for example. After that, they organized acts of terror against civilians of the Republic, and they established cooperation with Western intelligence bodies. And I believe that it is the Western intelligence bodies who established cooperation with them, or probably they have never severed it, and they just re-recruited members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Earlier, we were talking about the fascist machine, but later all these contacts were transferred to the Western European machine. The United States and Canada especially, they received financial assistance from them. But the same happens with the Kiev regime today. Earlier, they hesitated to talk about it, and they concealed all this information, but today no one hides it. Just look at the Foreign Minister of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, who said that she is proud of her grandfather who fought against enemies in Kaliningrad. Enemies in Kaliningrad, those are Red Army soldiers, and she's proud of her grandfather. And the Foreign Minister of Canada, Krista Friedlich, was proud of her grandfather. Remember that Homak, who issued a Nazi magazine in West Europe, and after that, that person disappeared in the West, and his granddaughter continued the work of her grandfather on a new technological level until the ultimate elimination of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Its members have committed more than 14,000 violent acts, and they killed more than 30,000 Soviet residents, children and seniors among them. And we see that the same story today happens to residents of Donbass and Azov region. It is difficult to read historical facts without shivering. April 11th, 1944, Novobrikol village, Strusov district, Ternopil region, Banderites changed into the Red Army uniform, and under disguise of works, they took 150 people and shot 115 of them. And the same happens in Bucha. The time has passed, but the same stories, the same methods are used. April 25th, 1944, Mogilnitsa village, Budanov district, Ternopil region, in several pits in the suburbs of the village, the Red Army soldiers found up to 100 corpses of men, women, and children, and tortured residents of village, as well as imprisoned Red Army soldiers. June 7th, 1944, Kosov village, Bezbozhenцы district, Ternopil region, 2 pits were found. There were 100 corpses of women, seniors, and children. Civilians were killed without the use of firearms. They were hit to death by heavy objects. The same pits and cemetery and graves were found on the territory of Donbass. Our investigative authorities, the executive committee, were circulating these materials in at international platforms and in international organizations, the civilized platforms that care for human rights, but they preferred to ignore that. Again, the same methods, the same crimes. But why? Because the ideology is the same, the Nazi ideology. And the revival of Ukrainian nationalism happened after the collapses of Soviet Union, because at that time Ukraine has embarked on a dangerous path of toying with the Ukrainian nationalist ideology. Why they did that? Because it was actively sponsored. Because they received money from the United States and Canada for glorification of members of these organizations. They received so many credits and promises that were never kept. They were bribed to do that. And another story is including the ideological successors and descendants in the political life of today's Ukraine. It has become a novel know-how. It has become a spiral towards the destruction of Ukrainian statehood, because the vast majority of Ukraine couldn't accept that, which resulted in the split of the country. It has been brewing for many years. It has been brewing for so many years, and after that, the situation inside Ukraine exploded. And this policy has resulted into an armed coup d'etat in February 2014, which was sponsored by the West, which was preceded by the interference in domestic affairs by Western countries. And they used nationalist battalions to do that. They used representatives of the public life of Ukraine, the so-called public life of Ukraine, which was actually Nazi-oriented and which was sponsored by the West. It was called a civil society, some civil society, but actually those were political mercenaries, and some of them were armed mercenaries, and they trained in Baltic states and in Poland in relevant training camps. We were talking about it for so many years, since 2014. And today the Collective West is actively supporting the criminal Kiev regime. Why? Because they have been raising it. They have been raising the ideology of radical Ukrainian nationalists from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists because they made it a major power to turn Ukraine into a foothold against Russia to destabilize the situation in the region, to make Russia suffer a strategic defeat, so that historically, as the West believes, to obtain a revenge. In the middle of the 20th century, they failed to do that. But I believe that they're going to make a mistake this year again. Again, I would like to stress the importance that we have published these materials on the ministry's website. These are not. This is not the exhaustive list of crimes. These are just examples. But I would like to stress that Ukrainian criminals will not avoid responsibility. Russian law enforcement agencies are doing their work. Organizers and perpetrators of crimes will be brought to justice, like their predecessors from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And now let's move to the modern issues, ecology. We see quite an interesting trend because all ecologies disappear. When we start talking about Ukraine, for example, I would like to draw your attention that the website of the ministry will upload the material on the responsibility of Ukraine for the environmental degradation in the region, with the sponsorship of Western regimes since the start of the conflict. All the crimes of the Ukrainian armed forces are numerous and they are well documented. In the aggression against Crimea and Donbass since 2014, the used methods had caused serious and long-term damage to the environment. After the decision of Crimea to join Russia in 2014, Ukrainian authorities has cut off water supplies in the peninsula, and they have flooded the vast territories in the mouth of the Dnieper River, which caused critical damage for the Lower Dnieper National Nature Park. At the same time, the vast territories of Kherson area and Crimea were exposed to severe drought. Kiev regime was proud of it. They didn't conceal it. No, they were really proud of that. Like today, there are numerous materials that call people to support the explosion and detonations of civilian infrastructure in Crimea. This is the materials that are published by the Kiev regime and media controlled by it, or to take part in these acts of sabotage. They're truly proud of what they're doing. They stimulate people to support these extremist and terrorist acts. And since 2014, Gemilov and his terrorist organization are proud that they can talk at the international platforms about how useful such acts of extremism are, like, for example, the mining of electricity communications in Crimea, cutting off water supplies. They made presentations in the Council of Europe and other democratic institutions in Europe. And the next 8 years of military crimes of the Kiev regime against breakaway Lugansk and Donetsk has caused serious damage to ecosystems and biodiversity of national parks, with particular Askania Nova Biosphere Reserve. Ukrainian army destroyed the civilian production facilities in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, which caused massive water, soil, and air pollution with dangerous chemicals. I have to stress that since 2014, such actions of the Kiev regime were implemented in the region that were considered part of Ukraine until they joined Russia as a result of referendums in 2022. It is difficult to explain it other than total indifference to the future of these places and total hatred towards people on an ethnic or national basis. The destruction of the Kakhovska hydropower plant in June 2023 by Kiev regime has caused a large-scale environmental disaster of the regional scale, and it stands out in the long range of ecological crimes of Kiev. It flooded at least 280,000 hectares, and this area exceeds the area of some states, Luxembourg, for example, and rapid flows has caused a massive loss in flora and fauna in several nature parks, like Lower Dnieper Nature Park, Kamenskoye Sich Nature Park, Great Meadows Nature Park, and it has caused irreparable damage to flora and fauna listed in the Red Book of the Russian Federation and its habitat. And since the water level dropped dramatically, all the fish of the Kakhovka Dam died. We're talking about 43 species of fish. In the midterm, there is a risk of the further degradation of ecosystems and desertification of soil of a vast area in the downstream of the Dnieper River due to the destruction of the central water reservoir that fed irrigation channels in this area. As a result of the Ukrainian attack on the dam, hazardous toxic substances and pollutants ended up in the Black Sea with water flows from sewers and other infrastructural facilities and had a negative effect on the ecosystem of the Black Sea. In the flooded area, there were 23,000 residential buildings, 16 cemeteries, 15 waste facilities like 3 landfills and 12 dumps. Also, 350 tons of technical oil from power generating units of the Kakhovka Dam spilled into water. And we are making efforts to mitigate the consequences. We are reestablishing the telephone communications and electricity supply, and we are carrying out the large-scale repairs and restoration works, and we conduct continuous sanitary and epidemiological monitoring of the environment and take animal epidemic countermeasures. The scale of damage is yet to be determined by ecologists and scientists, and the relevant work at this moment is complicated by the ongoing hostilities, but it's important to remember other ecological crimes of Kiev and Western authorities, Western countries that support Kiev by providing weapons. The decisions of the United Kingdom and the United States to supply Kiev with the depleted uranium rounds have led to the gravest long-term consequences for the region. As a result, water and soil of the vast territories were contaminated with radiation. Authorities are trying to avoid the explanations and say that it's not going to lead to severe consequences, but just look at the situation from the chemical point of view, and there is no other way than call it a global disaster. And the evidence from the use of such munitions by NATO forces in Yugoslavia and Iraq indicates that numerous cases of cancer and premature death should be expected in the affected areas, as well as long-term negative effect of radiation for the population and flora and fauna. Recently, the Secretary of State Blinken said that he is concerned about food security because without Ukrainian grains, the world won't survive. But the countries of the European Union said that they're not going to accept the Ukrainian grain. But the question is, what is going to happen with the grains that is going to grow on the contaminated soil that will be contaminated with the depleted uranium? But they prefer not to talk about it. And representatives always say that that it's not so dangerous as it seems at the first glance.
But we have official data provided by scientists. The science hasn't been absolutely abolished in the United States. There are attempts, and money is omnipotential. It's true, but it's impossible to cancel this data. What will happen to the grain that will become the harvest of this contaminated soil? Will the consumers or mediators be able to conduct analysis and to differentiate between good grain and the grain of bad quality? And now the EU just doesn't think about it. It's not important or relevant for it right now. It's more important for it to gain money, and I believe that it's not going to face this problem. The consequence of using cassette ammunitions has led to large-scale destruction of ecosystem. The massive use by Ukraine of obsolete mines caused the contamination of a vast area of the Black Sea with hazardous substances drifting. Ukrainian munitions have been found all along the coastline of the western Black Sea. The aforementioned facts are being recorded in detail by Russian law enforcement agencies and other competent departments. We assume that Ukraine and its accomplices among the states supplying the weapons in question will be responsible for compensating for environmental damage and restoring ecology in the former Ukrainian territories after the conflict is over. And I would like to remind those Western countries who believe that it's not going to affect them, that when they conducted experiments in Libya, Syria, and Iraq, they also believed that it wouldn't affect them. And the organizations working in the area of human rights believed that it had nothing to do with them. Maybe that they saw that maybe their actions were not well justified, but still it was important for them that it was happening far away from them in the Arab world, and that it had nothing to do with the Western European countries. Yes, it is really far away from West, but these countries have come to the territories of Western countries, migrating there. They have entered the countries of the European Union. And today, just like over the recent 10 years, scientific conferences are held, whether in Greece or Poland or Italy, in order to stop the illegal influx of migrants from the countries where NATO conducted experiments to impose democracy. And the same has happened to Ukraine. Do you remember for how long Ukraine was teased and it was promised to become a member of the so-called Western community, and now it's not so far away from the membership of the EU, and it's about to be accepted into NATO's ranks. But where has it led to? Now Ukraine hasn't been accepted to any of these organizations. But still, people have come and de facto have become members of the EU, and there are scientific conferences, roundtables, and so on, in order to decide what to do with the Ukrainian citizens who have answered the appeal and the invitation of who have accepted the invitation of Western countries, who have come there and are not going to leave. And they require even more than the refugees from the Middle East required before. And that's because they have sacrificed their country for the sake of Western experiments. If the majority of the Middle East countries did not welcome the experiments conducted on them, and some of them resisted. For example, Syria did that. Most of the Ukrainians believed in the bright future that was promised to them, and they sacrificed their independence and country in order to lead a prosperous and carefree life. And when it didn't happen, they came to EU countries on their own and started to demand more than regular refugees. And there is another piece of news which is not very pleasant for the EU country. So, it is that they are not going to leave. And another interesting topic which has to do with Ukraine, West, and all these heinous falsifications. On the 26th of The anniversary of the terrorist attacks on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines off the coast of Denmark and Sweden will be marked. These events are unprecedented. We're talking about a heinous crime, a blatant sabotage of important part of pan-European energy infrastructure. It should be recalled that as early as September the 28th, 2022, in the Russian Federation, a criminal case was initiated under the article on an act of international terrorism, part 1 of Article 361 of the Criminal Code of Russia. Russian competent authorities continue to investigate. There is an exchange. There is no exchange of the data. We are refused any exchange, though who ordered for terrorist attacks on Nord Streams had been had a very specific goal to break mutually beneficial energy ties between Russia and Europe. The actions of the authorities of European countries show that this whole action was ordered and conducted from one center. Thus, despite numerous official requests from the Russian side to the leadership of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, to share the information available to their investigative bodies on this topic, they still persistently refuse to cooperate, do not provide any clear answers. Copenhagen and Stockholm declare that certain investigative actions are continuing, the deadline for the end of which has not been determined. The messages sent in October 2022 by Mikhail Mishustin, chairman of the government of Russia, to the heads of government of these states on the need to conduct a comprehensive and open investigation of the gas pipeline explosion, with the participation of the Russian authorities and Gazprom, remain unanswered. In November 2022, the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation appealed to the Royal Danish Police and the Swedish Prosecutor's Office for legal assistance, and the Danish and Swedish authorities refused, stated that granting our request would pose a threat to national security. Can you imagine that? But what do they want to achieve? What goals of theirs became a real threat to their own security? This question remains unanswered. Copenhagen and Stockholm responded to the initiative to establish joint investigative teams by saying that Danish and Swedish law enforcement authorities had no such interest. The fact that the collective West has something to hide is also confirmed by the feverish actions of the Swedish prosecutor's office, which said at the end of June this year that this did rule out that all data on this case could be classified. But where is this? Who is this data hidden from? From the public opinion, from environmentalists, from companies who suffered losses. Such a heinous crime was committed, and it's even impossible to analyze so far its consequences for the environment. And what about the right for the access to information? Those another double standards of Westerners in the human rights sphere. That's what you're going to say. I'm going to say that there are no standards at all. Denmark and Sweden have repeatedly stated that they allegedly provided our country with all the necessary information on the investigation, which is not true. At the same time, the media generating new versions of what happened, which only strengthen our doubts about the desire of the states to identify the organizers and perpetrators of a terrorist act at a critical facility of the energy infrastructure. We really have doubts that these countries have such a willingness. What is worse, a thrilling story about certain Ukrainian saboteurs on a sailing vessel who tricked Western security services. They managed to gain access to Nord Streams 1 and 2, and the goal is obvious: to avert suspicion from those who are really behind the sabotage of the ski facility of the energy infrastructure, which caused enormous economic and environmental consequences. Everyone forgot what the US president had said, as well as his numerous functionaries in February and March 2022. They said that they would destroy that piece of infrastructure, but Western Europe was not even allowed to think about it, not to mention to conduct an investigation. And they not only divert attention from the key issues, but also they clean up the traces of the crime and create a false picture of Russia's involvement in it. And everything is done in the media area. And after that, according to the law of the genre, the guilty will be announced. The scenario has already been repeatedly worked out. And I constantly recall Kyiv's provocations in Bucha. Do you remember what happened there? When Russian armed forces left the city, the mayor of Bucha gave an interview and said that everything was calm in the city and everything was okay with the people. There were no emergencies. But in a day, he changed his mind, and footages appeared showing the streets of the city covered with corpses. And so far, no one, neither international organizations, nor volunteers, nor the Kyiv's regime, nor human rights activists have seen the list of people in question. That's because there are no such lists. We even asked for them in the United Nations Secretariat. Lavrov requested these footages during the meeting with Mr. Guterres, but there are no lists. We're not provided with such kinds of lists. Likewise, there were no fair trials on the Skripal's case, by the way. I remember it all. I remember the hysteria by Theresa May in the Parliament of Great Britain. I remember the publications in British newspapers. I remember programs on the British TV. I remember that Russian diplomats were recalled. I remember that Trump was shown pictures with suffering dogs on phones, but I don't remember what Scotland Yard said about this Skripal's case. Over these years, it should have said something. Many years have passed, and so far nothing has been said. Is it true? Is it real? Yes, it's possible. The same happened to Litvinenko and the so-called poisoning of Navalny. These things happen on a regular basis. That is their style. Each of these theatrical productions were needed only to put pressure on our country, to explain why Russian diplomats were to be revoked, why they refused to respect their own bilateral and multilateral organizations in order to convince their own public not to take part in Russian forums, forums, or not to invest in our country, and to severe full-fledged ties with our country, and not to keep their promises in the area of issuing visas. Every time there was a theatrical production and there is no proof of guilt of our country, and they simply cannot be. I'm talking about the publications that are already appearing in the Western countries. Despite massive propaganda, the Western elites have not managed to fool their own public this time. Just remember the historical reaction to the high-profile material published in February of this year by well-known American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. I will remind you of this reaction. There was silence, as if there were no such journalist in the United States. So he used to be a high-profile investigative journalist, but he is ignored as if he had never existed. Having conducted a detailed analysis of the circumstances of the terrorist attack on the Nord Streams, he directly pointed out the explosion of the gas pipelines was the result of a covert operation by the UN Navy and Norwegian military. In March and June of this year, the Wall Street Journal reported that Western intelligence agencies knew that the Kiev regime was preparing a terrorist attacks on Nord Streams, and the journal said that it had been done by the Kiev regime. Apparently, everyone knew that Biden had said 6 months before the terrorist attack that he would destroy that piece of infrastructure. And obviously, the Western intelligence found out about that because they watch the American television. But apparently, not only they knew. Today, the German media, citing sources familiar with the investigation into the explosions in Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, are openly saying that the strings of the crime lead to the Kiev regime. From the Western point of view, the strings of the crime lead to the Kiev regime, and money is pumped in the same direction. When this whole production was staged around this Skripal's case, Russia was blamed of everything, and Russian diplomats were revoked from almost all countries of NATO or from the countries who expressed their solidarity with NATO. But what if the same newspapers in Great Britain had published that Russia was responsible for everything, and then Downing Street would provide our money with financement? So if the Western mass media say themselves that all the strings led to the Kiev's regime, but after that they claim that even more money and weapons were to be supplied, then I'm just speechless. It's curious that representatives of Western politicians, also they never publicly admitted, share these assessments. It's enough to recall the assessment of Mr. Kissinger in his conversation with Russian pranksters in July of this year. After a year, it has become absolutely clear to everyone the authorities of the EU states, primarily Germany, are purposefully refusing to adhere to an unbiased position on issues related to Russia. They have clearly demonstrated their inability and even disinterest in identifying the true perpetrators of the terrorist attack on the gas pipeline. And this despite the fact that everything happened in the area of the EU and NATO responsibility of its shores, and Europeans themselves suffered significant damage. As a direct consequence of such spinelessness and obsessive unwillingness to defend its interests to protect its own energy security, the EU has lost even theoretical chances of gaining strategic autonomy. The current authorities in Germany and almost all other EU countries have unconditionally submitted to the anti-Russian course dictated to them by the Anglo-Saxons. I would like to make a historical joke. Germany, throughout the course of its history, dreamed of becoming a colonizer, and its willingness turned it into a colony. Russia will certainly take this point into account in its foreign policy planning, including building foreign economic ties. We intend to bring the investigation into the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream pipelines last September to a conclusion. We will make every effort, including within the framework of multilateral formats, to ensure that the truth is made public. Among the next steps is the UN Security Council briefing scheduled for September the 26th on the occasion of the anniversary of the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. I'd like to remind that over the past years, our country has raised this issue in the UN Security Council. On our initiative on February the 21st and July the 11th of this year, the Council held meetings on this topic. On March the 27th this year, owing to the active resistance of Western delegations, Russian draft resolution providing for the establishment of international mechanisms to investigate the undermining of gas pipelines failed to garner a sufficient number of votes. So Western has no impartial investigation. That's why it blocked the relevant draft resolution.
And another absurd news from the West. As you know, on September 7th, a joint press release was published by the OSCE chairman in office, Minister of Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly President and Director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. This press release condemns the holding of then upcoming legislative and municipal elections in new Russian territories, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. There is nothing new for us, but we have to note that OSCE officials do not understand the powers that are enshrined and the relevant mandates adopted by consensus, but they don't aspire to take an objective approach to assessing the current realities. OSCE officials should establish a normal practice of monitoring of electoral processes, which should be based on the agreed electoral monitoring rules agreed upon and approved by all OSCE participating states, instead of making comments on the territorial arrangements of participating states. But since they believe that they can comment on all of these processes and they cannot help themselves but to comment the territorial arrangements of an OSCE participating states, then I'm expecting their joint press release about Kosovo and about all the developments unfolding there, elections, negotiating process, statements on independence, sovereignty. I forgot when the OSCE chairman in office and other leading bodies made comments with regard to Kosovo. And I will recall that the decision of the authorities of Kosovo that they become an independent state has no international legal justification. It contravenes UN Security Council Resolution 1244. I would like to pose the question again. Are the chairman in office of the OSCE and OSCE Parliamentary Assembly President and the director of VADIA, what was the last time when you made a statement about it? Because Kosovo is holding elections too. And there are other important significant events. For example, on September 21st, the Republic of Armenia will celebrate the 22nd anniversary of its independence. We are convinced that the development of versatile cooperation between Russia and Armenia meet the core interests of people of the two countries, and we support strengthening mutual understanding on key issues of bilateral and regional agenda, as well as to strengthen foreign political coordination at international platforms and within common integration associations. We wish Armenians and staff of the Armenian Foreign Ministry good health, prosperity, and success, and with serious commitment to develop diverse and mutually beneficial ties with our CSTO ally and to strengthen humanitarian and social economic presence on the south of Armenia is confirmed by the establishment of a new Russian diplomatic mission in a strategically important region of Armenia. The advanced group of Russian diplomats arrived to Kapan, an administrative center, in the beginning of September to prepare for the opening of the Consulate General. And by establishing a new diplomatic mission, it will become easier to establish interregional contacts and to strengthen education and cultural interaction. And it will expand opportunities for local businesses to establish cooperation with Russian partners. And Russian people living in the region will have a full and unimpeded access to the state services. We're going to provide consular advice and counseling. And as for the date and the time of the seminar, we're going to put it on the internet resources of the Russian embassy. Epidemiologists say and warn us about COVID and so on and so forth. We noticed at another material, American medical press on immunology published the effect of American-German vaccine Pfizer-BioNTech on the child's immune system. According to this analysis, 30 samples were studied. Compared with other vaccines, Pfizer releases less antibodies for coronavirus. It, quite on the contrary, it weakens the immune system of children and provokes the development of HIV, and there is a high risk of contracting other infectious diseases like staphylococcus, tuberculosis, pneumonia, hepatitis B, and COVID-19. It damaged brain tissues and the neural system. I would like to stress, we're not talking about the Russian media or Russian scientists. It was posted by the Western scientists, and the negative effects were manifested for 6 months. They don't rule out the destruction of the immune system for vaccinated children. I would like to say that it was published. We're going to publish all that in the text version of the briefing. It were published the results of the research for the effects of the Pfizer-BioNTech for elders year after the vaccination. The immune system was developed only for a third of all the senior citizens, and all of the citizens who had only the first dose didn't have an ready immune system for the new variants of the coronavirus. And we have worse news for the people with the weak immune system. We noticed that they had even less antibodies than those who didn't vaccinate. It is also to draw the attention to the data that was posted by the Russian Ministry of Defense, that Pfizer-BioNTech had real evidence that there was a high risk of developing serious pathologies for the cardiovascular system after getting vaccinated. So the Pfizer vaccine was issued with serious side effects because of the collusion of the producers and Western officials. Medical community was well aware of these side effects, but they have never corrected the situation. Anthony Fauci actually was unable to prove the usefulness of vaccination instead of using the natural immune system. By paying big bribes to different structures like the European Commission, you all remember the scandal with Ursula von der Leyen, with how many batches of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines were bought. Everyone were talking about it. Just another absurd news. Last week, verified accounts of Russian Foreign Ministry were again subjected to undisguised censorship from the American IT corporations. Our YouTube channel faced with new restrictions. They deleted more than 20 materials, including 12 briefings. We've been through this before in March and April 2022, as then it was done under the formal pretext of violating community guidelines, but they deleted the remarks of Sergey Lavrov during the high-level segment of the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council on March 1st, 2022, and Sergey Lavrov's interview to TV channels RT, NBC News, ABC News, ITN, France 24, China Media Group, etc. At that time, we said that we're going to take restrictions with regard to Western journalists. And now I speak to the media politica. Don't ask what's wrong with the European, EU, American journalists that for some reason cannot have an accreditation or a visa. Everything is okay with them. But what's not okay is that those who are involved in these manipulations, normal journalists, work as journalists, and those who are involved in information warfare, they do everything to distort the information space. We're going to respond to that. We know how to do that. And we're going to take responsive measures this time. I'm not going to dwell on that anymore, but I have an only question. All these channels that I listed, are they aware that their interview has been deleted from YouTube? The most interesting thing that no one knows what the reason is. We're going to give all the links in the text of our briefing, and we are going to notify all those corporations who interviewed our minister and who became victims of YouTube's censorship due to unknown reasons. If you look at the rules of community guidelines, it says that YouTube does not allow content that promotes violence against individuals or groups or that encourages to commit violence. YouTube does not allow to upload videos that encourage to humiliate or insult individuals or groups. Wait a second. We need them to delete all the CNN videos. There is one Ukrainian channel. There is nothing but hatred. Then we need to delete BBC videos. There are so many reports and statements what you should do with Russia and Russians. The same applies to German media. Everything is full of hatred towards Russia and Russians. What should we do with all the statements that are made by the Kiev regime? They openly call to kill as many Russians as possible. For example, Russia should disappear from the world map. Ukraine hates you, Russians. These are statements made by Ukrainian officials. You can find it on YouTube. I'm going to delete that. In our briefings and the interview of the Russian foreign minister and other representatives, we haven't made any statements, any allusions to hate speech. We have never said anything like that because it contradicts our philosophy of lives. All our videos are posted on the ministry's website in Russian and in other languages. You can find them on YouTube and other social media platforms. And as for the YouTube and its owner, Google Corporation, they need to stop the total cleanup of the digital space from other alternative point of views, and they need to stop servicing the political order of Washington within the information warfare and hybrid aggression against Russia. And we're also celebrating the 50th anniversary of Guinea-Bissau's independence. We established diplomatic relations in 1973. We established regular political dialogue at the high and the highest level. Delegation of the Guinea-Bissau, led by its president, took part in the second Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg. I'll recall that it took place on July 27th and 28th, and on the sidelines of the summit, he met with the Russian President Putin. Interparliamentary cooperation develops gradually, and the delegation of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau, led by the President of the National People's Assembly, its parliament, took part in the Second International Parliamentary Conference Russia-Africa that was hosted by Moscow. And on the sidelines of the forum, he met with the Speaker of the State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, and they made an agreement to establish the group of friendship between parliaments of the two countries. And during the 77th session of the UN General Assembly, Guinea-Bissau traditionally supported Russian draft resolutions countering glorification of Nazism, outer space, international information securities, and they abstained from voting on anti-Russian draft resolutions. And there is significant potential of developing bilateral trade, economic, and investment ties. In 2023, Russian mining companies are increasingly interested in the markets of Guinea-Bissau. In April 2023, Rusal company visited Guinea-Bissau in order to assess the prospects of developing bauxite deposits. In March 2023, Guinea-Bissau was visited by the local company. They explored an opportunity to take part in the extraction of hydrocarbons on the local shelf, and we're also developing our cooperation in education. More than 5,000 Guinean specialists studied in Soviet or Russian universities over the past 5 years. The quota of state scholarships was doubled for the Republic of Guinea-Bissau for the academic year 2022-2023. 57 people studied, and 15 Guinean students also had an opportunity to study in Russia due to the university Olympiads. And for the next academic year, we decided to increase the quota up to 75, and we're ready to continue our fruitful, versatile cooperation with Guinea-Bissau for the benefit of its people in the interests of supporting peace and stability in Africa. And we wish every success and prosperity to the people of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau. And another significant event that is celebrated on September 19th is the 20th anniversary of the entry into force of the Charter of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which today has established as an independent, influential, and credible participant of the system of international relations. The Charter sets out the ideological and philosophical foundation of the organization, its fundamental principles that are directed towards equality, mutual consideration of interest, respect for the independent way of development of each member state, and its openness towards the joint search of the best mutually acceptable solutions. Drawing on this innovative document, the SU makes a real contribution to building a new, just, multipolar world order and ensuring reliable security and sustainable development in the organization. The compelling evidence of how attractive the organization is could be the expansion of its membership. As of today, the organization has 9 member states, and Belarus in the final stage of obtaining the status of a member state. And now we have 14 dialogue partners and 2 observers, and the number of countries willing to join the SCO process continues to grow. And Russia sees the SCO and the development of multilateral cooperation in this format as one of the key priorities of our foreign policy. Международная жизнь, please, your question.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Recently, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has come up with the initiative for the leaders of Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia to hold a quadripartite meeting in Karabakh. How could you comment on this initiative? Yes, we have seen comments of media on this issue, but we haven't received a corresponding official appeal of the Turkish side yet. We traditionally maintain a close dialogue with Ankara on various aspects of the international agenda, including the situation in the South Caucasus and the perimeters of joint work within the framework of the consultative regional platforms 3+3. Thank you very much. One more question. On September the 15th this year, speaking on the settlement of the situation around Ukraine, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said, now the efforts of the Vatican, whose envoy is about to arrive once again in Moscow, are continuing. We are ready to meet and talk to everyone. Could you clarify whether there are specific dates for Cardinal Matteo Zuppi's visit to Moscow? As you know, we respect the efforts of the Holy See aimed at finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the special military operation, we have maintained a fairly regular and constructive dialogue with the Vatican, as evidenced in particular by the recent visit to Moscow by Cardinal Matteo Zuppi. Our dialogue has traditionally been open and trusting. In addition, that's how our work has been developed. Bilateral interaction on humanitarian issues has been significantly strengthened. We are ready to continue such cooperation, as well as further contacts with representatives of the Vatican. If we receive any detailed and concrete information, we'll share it with you. If that's all, do we have Radio Sputnik with us? Yes. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. Oleg Obokhov, observer of the Radio Sputnik. Joe Biden intends to raise the issue of making changes to the architecture of the UN Security Council. The statement was made by Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby ahead of the U.S. President's upcoming address to the UN General Assembly. How timely is such a proposal? Is the reform of the UN Security Council necessary in the current circumstances? Everyone has been talking about reforming the UN Security Council for a very long time. Maybe Mr. Biden has just got acquainted with the relevance of this topic, but it has been on the agenda for about 10 years or even more. The question is about the way of conducting such a reform or expansion. Our position is the following. It shouldn't be conducted just for the sake of the processes itself, and it shouldn't affect any aspects of the work of the Security Council, which is already being conducted with such severe difficulties, and we want to avoid a possible crisis. And if such a reform is to be conducted, it should has an ultimate goal, and it should improve the efficiency of this important body. Obviously, bearing in mind new international realities, that's why we always make an emphasis on the necessity to adapt the work of the UN Security Council to modern realities. We take part in negotiations in New York. During specialized discussions, we analyze all the aspects of possible reforms, including the membership, the right of veto, regional representation, the size of the councils, its relations with the General Assembly. We are convinced that Russian Foreign Minister has talked on multiple occasions on this matter. If you look for such information on the internet, you will find a lot of material related to this matter. And we are convinced that against the background of the emergence of a multipolar world order, the emergence of new centers of power in the global south, the Security Council should be expanded only with the entering of developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that regionally claim a more significant role. We especially emphasize that natural candidates as India and Brazil, and we advocate correcting the historical injustice against the African continent within the parameters agreed upon by the Africans themselves. But increasing the number of already overrepresented Western states in the Council in any category of membership, or those states that completely associate themselves with NATO, will not add to the democratic character of the Security Council and will not bring us any closer to building a fairer architecture of international relations, and will block the very purposes of the UN. Therefore, in particular, the ambitions of Germany and Japan to obtain permanent residence in this body are absolutely groundless. In this issue of reforming the Security Council, we should be cautious. We should act with deliberation, since the authority of this key element of the UN architecture is at stake. There are serious contradictions between countries in all aspects of the reform agenda, which must be painstakingly overcome. An eventual reform model should enjoy the support of the overwhelming majority of member states and ideally be endorsed by consensus. And we should proceed from the very grounds laid under the foundation of the UN, and analyzing the existing international realities. No conditions for concrete steps on this track have been developed yet. Do you have more questions? Yes, I have one more question regarding the relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It has been said that these countries will not sign a peace treaty at the European Political Community Summit in Granada in October. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said that. What circumstances can prevent the countries from reaching an agreement, in your opinion? who should reach an agreement with whom? Azerbaijan and Armenia. You know, at every briefing, every time I repeat the same thing. There is a solid legal framework for the implementation of everything that has been agreed upon. Even oral agreements have been recorded, but it's counterproductive to set any exact terms for the signing of a peace treaty. We don't know how it's going to be developed or signed. What is more important is to lay the foundations for everything that has been agreed upon in writing, in the official way, and such a document should ensure a balance of interests between Azerbaijan and Armenia to serve the most important goal, which is to lay the foundations for a lasting and sustainable peace in the region. And this can be achieved through consistent implementation of the roadmap of the Armenian-Azerbaijani normalization process, which is a set of agreements. Thank you very much. Let's continue. Do we have Media Corporation China with us? Yes, we have only one question. Jens Stoltenberg has recently said that they should be ready for a long war in Ukraine, and he emphasized that the Russian-Ukrainian conflict will not end soon. Indeed, more and more Western weapons are being supplied to Ukraine, according to him, and perhaps the United States will provide Ukraine with a long-range missile system equipped with cluster bombs. Many countries around the world are now looking for a political settlement to the conflict. Recently, China's ambassador to Russia, John Han-Hui, renewed his call for negotiations to avoid escalation of the conflict. However, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is calling to prepare for a long war. How you comment on this? I can emphasize that for a long time, they have deemed it necessary to keep in secret that they want a protracted crisis in the region, and that is very similar to the so-called manageable chaos that has been laid in the foundation of the Western community. It hasn't been manageable for a long time, for over a decade, but when they say that it's necessary to prepare for a protracted crisis, I think that they are not sincere. What they should have said is that they are preparing a protracted crisis, and we see all the manifestations of it, illegal sanctions, the supply of military equipment, which is being expanded, and so on. I mean that Stoltenberg has almost said the truth, but the wording is to be more precise. It's not that the world is to be prepared for a prolonged crisis, but he should have said that NATO is preparing it. Thank you. Do you have only one question? Yes, we do. Do we have RBK with us? Yes, we are here. Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. How does the ministry assess the statement by the Prime Minister of Armenia that the Russian peacekeeping contingent failed to fulfill its task in Nagorno-Karabakh? We have seen several statements, and in the autumn of 2020, the Prime Minister of Nagorno-Karabakh said that it would never be a part of Azerbaijan and that it was impossible. And as for this, then he changed his mind. And as for this statement, it should be assessed in the similar way. We know what should be done in order to settle the situation. I keep repeating it at every briefing, and everyone who is involved in the negotiations as mediators on behalf of Russia have repeatedly said that we should normalize the situation, try to calm the parties down and to be responsible towards the obligation that have been assumed. And Azerbaijan has recently mentioned anti-terrorist operations on the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Has Baku informed Moscow on that, and how can such actions affect the region? We maintaining contacts with Azerbaijan in particular, and I believe that based on the results of the contacts, a relevant statement will be made by the Russian Foreign Ministry. As for the notification, we have been receiving such information from Azerbaijan. Thank you very much. Do we have the Moscow Post with us? Yes. We have two questions. One has already been asked by my colleague. Seoul has reacted rather harshly to North Korean leader's recent visit to the Russian Far East. In particular, the president of South Korea said in an interview with the Associated Press that military cooperation between North Korea and Russia was illegal and wrong because it contradicted UN Security Council resolutions and various international sanctions. There have been threats of retaliatory measures in case of deals between Moscow and Pyongyang on arms and missile technology transfers. How do you comment on such statements? We believe that such statements are inadequate and irrelevant if Seoul recalled and the international law, the existence of international law. We should remind them of the fact that South Korea is to be responsible for its proper actions in this area and not to join illegal unilateral sanctions, in particular imposed on Russia. And we believe that it shouldn't join any illegal sanctions. But since we are talking about our bilateral relations with South Korea, I mentioned the Russian Federation. That is the first thing to be taken into account. Secondly, we believe that this reaction is too emotional. And we call upon Seoul not to be guided by any rumors, because decisions made on such a shaky basis can seriously damage our country's relations, which are already going through difficult time due to Seoul's participation in illegal anti-Russian sanction and its participation in the policy of expanded deterrence. We believe that the summit that took place doesn't lead to aggravating the tension on the Korean Peninsula, and quite the opposite. It will meet the interests of Seoul itself. Moreover, I would like to add, if there are some questions or issues to be clarified or double check something, then as far as the theory and the practice of diplomatic work go, people shouldn't be guided by publications in newspapers. There can be a professional analysis, but still, it's better to stick to the diplomatic context. And to do that, we need to maintain the possibilities of a normal dialogue and for normal communication as diplomacy itself intends. Then there will be an exchange of opinions and all the answers will be given. And we are always ready for this kind of work, despite the difference in opinions and approaches. We are always ready to conduct mutually respectful dialogue on a mutually beneficial and respectful basis. Thank you very much. Do we have Reuters with us? Yes, Madam Zakharova, good afternoon. If you allow, I have two questions. Yeah. So my first questions, after the recent shelling and strikes on Crimea, in particular on a shipyard in Sevastopol. Media reported that those were British Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Can you confirm these reports, and how will Moscow respond to London? So I will start with the second part of the question. As for cruise missiles, that should be addressed to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. I'm not sure that they are going to speak about it in advance, but after their response, they may inform you on that. As for the usage of foreign weapons provided by Britain in particular, it's a specific aspect, and I need to ask our military about that. Thank you. I have one more question also related to the crisis in Ukraine. Our colleagues from New York Times said that the shelling of Konstantinovka that Ukraine accused Russia of, according to their investigation, was launched with a Ukrainian missile book. Can you also comment on that? Yes, it's being developed, and I believe as soon as experts finish their work, we will publish it. It's a very interesting and multifaceted topic with a historical background, and I believe that soon we will publish it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do we have Compact TV from Germany? Yes, Madam Zakharova, I have a strategic question. There is still a big difference between the Russian and the American foreign policy. The Americans overthrow, topple governments, and they replace them with obedient puppets. Russia hasn't done that so far, and as the Soviet Union before, Russia currently supports such states as Syria, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Can sensible citizens invest in Europe, especially in Germany, rely on a more active support by Russia in order to overthrow the yoke of Washington and its vassals from Berlin? I believe that it shouldn't be considered as a football game. I pay attention to your observers who are sincerely sympathetic and who are sensitive about international relations. It seems like they're watching a championship and they support this or that team.
But we need to understand this is not just a game, that it's a beautiful process where there are winners and losers, and the next day everything can be started from scratch. Today, lives are at stake. We're talking about people from faraway regions or people of the second class, like they were thinking about people living in countries, or, for example, Eastern Slavs. That's how they call them, second-class people. They're involved in the hot phase of the conflict in Ukraine. We're talking about food security, we're talking about radiological security, bacteriological security, bearing in mind the number of biological laboratories constructed by the United States in our region and all over the world. Security due to the mining of many territories, and I beg your pardon, ideological security, because ideology of Nazism, neo-Nazism, fascism, discrimination, xenophobia is rampant and is sponsored by the West. So there is a lot of aspects of security. Should I talk about ecological security, because I raised this issue, the detonation of Nord Stream pipelines, all this events have become like an everyday phenomenon. No one is surprised. Illegal exploitation and production of natural resources of oil in the Syrian territories occupied by the United States. What's going on with the environment there? No one knows. And the West totally forgot about the counter-terrorism, counter-extremism cooperation because they use terrorist and extremist cells to confront with the undesired countries. So we should talk about the current developments, not like a fascinating confrontation, but we should see it from the perspective that the fate of our planet is at stake. We also said that the difference between the US and Russian foreign policy is that Americans topple governments and that Russia has never done that. We have never done it, and we're not going to do that in the future. I'll just tell you that we will continue to do and to act in the opposite way because we have always supported the legitimacy of legitimate authorities, and we proved that in Syria. And the case of Syria has shown our principled approach. We are not for reshaping. We support the preservance of statehood. This is the basis of security, both regional and global. We have done so much to maintain opportunities for the peace process in Ukraine. We have elaborated Minsk Accords that were signed by many international actors, including it was approved by the UN Security Council resolution. When it became unimplemented and the West stated that they were never going to implement the Minsk Accords and people were killed, were murdered, then it was the threat of regional and global risk, and we launched the special military operation. So if you wait that we'll become like Western countries, we won't act in that way because we will lose if we'll act this way. You can't just fight the thing that you don't like by using the same methods, because you will become this evil, and it will be worse than defeat. It will be double defeat for us. We continue to be ourselves. We will uphold legitimacy, right. We will uphold law, justice. We will protect people based on law. And we'll preserve historical memory, and we won't let anyone to impose a foreign devastating ideology. Sorry for being philosophical, but that's how you ask your question. News.ru, please. Hello, news agency news.ru. We have several questions. Can you confirm that the formal commander of the United Group of Forces, Sergey Lavrov, has taken the post of the Coordinating Committee of the Commonwealth of Independent States on Air Defense? Can you comment the rumors that he's going to head the mission, peace mission in Sahel? I think you confuse me with Mr. Konashenkov because it is a question for the Ministry of Defense of Russia. In line with the agreement on establishing the United System of Air Defense of the member states of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was signed on February 10th, 1995, a coordination committee on air defense is a body within the Council of Defense Ministers of CIS member states. So again, if you have any questions about that, you should ask these questions to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Just we wouldn't like to provide contradicting information, and we have our areas of competence. Do you have any more questions? And we have the second question. What's your comment on the news about the simultaneous functioning of Lachin and Agdam corridor, and is Russia going to send another humanitarian assistance to that region? As for humanitarian assistance in Lachin and Agdam corridor, yesterday we published a comment that Russia continues to improve the humanitarian situation based on the initiative of the Russian foreign minister on the parallel deblocking of routes for humanitarian assistance, and on September 17th, due to the efforts of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Russian peacekeeping contingent, the Russian Foreign Ministry has delivered humanitarian assistance through 2 corridors, and we expect the further unimpeded deliveries of humanitarian cargo in the interests of local populations. I can only confirm our position with that regard. We're interested in supplying humanitarian assistance, and we will continue to take efforts to improve the humanitarian situation in the region. And the last question, what's your comment on the Joe Biden intention to meet with the leaders of 5 Central Asian states, what measures Moscow is going to take in response? We respect the sovereign right of states to develop their cooperation with other countries of the world, and we are doing that sincerely. And for many years and decades, we have been proving that position. But it is important that this cooperation would be beneficial and won't create new dividing lines and tensions. The role of the United States over the past years is devastating. They have best intentions, good, beautiful intentions, but in fact, they have quite the opposite consequences. Instead of establishing beneficial cooperation, they draw new dividing lines, and they try to put independent states with giving them a choice. Are you with us or are you against us? Just take this scenario that the United States used by interfering into domestic affairs of other states, and you will see that they're trying to dictate their false, artificial choice. And at the same time, they are trying to use a different set of political priorities that are unnatural for one region or another. It is essential that we see an attempt to tear countries of Central Asia away from their allies who have close history, geography, and from its neighbors also. And that was our last question. Thank you. We'll continue moving forward. Tverskaya 13. Hello, Ms. Zakharova. How could you comment a statement of the new Japanese foreign minister about the foreign policy of Japan? He said that they're going to support anti-Russian sanctions, but at the same time they plan to continue talks with Russia. I'm sorry, there was an interruption. Could you repeat your question? What is the commentary of the Russian Foreign Ministry about the statements of a new Japanese Foreign Minister, Yuki Kamikawa, about the Japan's foreign policy? They're going to support anti-Russian sanctions, but at the same time they plan to continue talks with Russia to cooperate with neighboring countries in their national interests, but in particular they want to develop cooperation in fishery and ensuring maritime security. After the start of the special military operation in February 2022, the Japanese government, in accordance with the will of Washington, they have pursued an outright hostile policy towards Russia. There are more and more packages of legitimate sanctions, and there are growing anti-Russian sentiments in the Japanese society, and there is increased military activity together with the United States and NATO allies near the far eastern boundaries of our country, and they also provide direct material technical assistance to the Kiev regime. In this context, positive cooperation is out of question, and to renew it Tokyo should at least immediately renounce its hostile policy that leads to the ultimate destruction of bilateral relations and escalation of tensions in the Asia-Pacific at large. Otherwise, the Russian Federation will continue to respond with the tough and sensitive countermeasures for Japan on the basis of its national interests. Economic operators and entrepreneurs in Japan has become victims of the actions of their own authorities on the Russian track, but actually they miscalculated. They failed to implement their own will, and they acted to the detriment of their own financial and economic interests. The Japanese economy and the Japanese society, because these issues affect the entire Japanese society in its sense, finance, economy, social, politics, and by the way, industry, everything. So now they faced with an issue how they can survive in the current conditions set by the Japanese authorities. This is a question of Japan's survival, but we're not guilty here. This is the result of the blind implementation of the policy dictated by Washington. Do you have any more questions? Yes, another question. And the upcoming session of the UN General Assembly, is it planned to discuss climate anomalies, particularly frequent floods, which claimed lives in Libya and which engulfed other regions in Middle East? On the sidelines of the high-level segment of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, we are going to have a series of events about certain aspects of climate change. But what you are talking about, the discussion of specific natural disasters and their consequences, is not planned for discussion. Maybe one country is going to have a sideline event or something like that, but I'm not aware of that. But nonetheless, on this occasion, I would like to express my solidarity with the people of Libya and other countries of Middle East due to the devastating floods over the last years. Consequences of such natural phenomena have become more and more apparent. It particularly affected developing countries where mitigation and restoration of infrastructure put a heavy burden for local authorities and population and downplays the progress made in social and economic development. In these conditions, it is necessary to provide assistance for the development of the most vulnerable states, particularly for those who are facing with the disasters that are provoked by the climate change. In this regard, it is regrettable that Western countries haven't implemented the decision to mobilize $100 billion that were obliged to do so within the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. Moskva, Baku, are you there with us? Hello, Ms. Zakharova. I have two questions. Due to the current situation in Karabakh, can you say why the situation is getting worse? If it results from the non-implementation of agreements, is the trilateral meeting possible? Okay, let's go step by step. I'm going to answer the first part of your question. We receive information from many sources, and we are alarmed by the escalation of situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. We heard the reports that the Azerbaijan armed forces are carrying out terrorist acts in the region, according to the Armenian side, and the Russian Federation calls the warring parties to stop the bloodshed, to cease hostilities, and go back to the political and diplomatic solution. We repeat it so many times, and we'd like to draw attention to the statements again. with a particular focus, that all the steps to solve the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute are mentioned in the statement of the leaders of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan that were adopted between the years 2020 and 2022. I would like also to note that by the efforts of the Russian Federation and other international intermediaries, we have established serious preconditions to resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute with peaceful means. I'm talking about the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Over the past weeks, we made statements and we have commented our practical steps in this regard. We're talking about the humanitarian assistance for the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. It creates favorable conditions for the renewal of a direct dialogue between Baku and Stepanakert, and that this circumstances the Russian peacekeeping contingent continues to do its job, and we believe that the safety of our peacekeepers will be ensured by all parties, and the Russian command of the Russian peacekeeping contingent is in constant contact with the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijani authorities to implement trilateral agreements reached at the highest level. Thank you. And what about the trilateral meeting? Is it possible? Is this meeting possible on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly? We will inform you about it if it's going to be planned. But we remain in contact with the sides to the conflict, and it is important to take this moment into account. What's your comment? The statement made by the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Yuri Kim, she made a confession about its intention to tear Armenia away from Russia. Last week, Armenia also organized the opening ceremony for the operational center of the EU monitoring capacity to Armenia. If we are talking about the statement made by Yuri Kim, made in the US Congress on September 14th, it is similar to the same statements that were made by John Stoltenberg. I had that question that we must prepare for a long conflict, for a long crisis in Ukraine, but it should be interpreted as NATO is preparing a long crisis in Ukraine. We had no illusions about Washington's goals in the past. Soviet countries, particularly in Transcaucasia, they want to cause a maximum damage to Russian positions and ties with the closest allies. And as for the goals, targets, collateral damage, the security architecture, additional targets, they're going to strike all the positive achievements that were reached by our country and our allies, but they wanted to strike on everything and to turn everything in chaos. Facing strong criticism from American lawmakers, the official of the State Department admitted that they have chosen Armenia as a new victim of geopolitical zero-sum games played by the United States, and they plan to tear away Russia and to reorient it towards West. It's said by Americans, ideologists who implement this policy. So when we hear from Armenian authorities that their military drills with NATO, with the NATO allies, that their anti-Russian actions taken together with the West are not anti-Russian and are not biased against Russia, and they don't threaten bilateral ties. But now we can say that the answer was given by the State Department.
It's not our responsibility anymore to convince the authorities in Yerevan that they are being pushed towards a very dangerous path. It has been already said in Washington. It has been already voiced. It's an official stance. I'm not sure that representatives of the U.S. State Department, as Yuri Kim in this case, and before that, Victoria Nuland, wanted to voice that. In particular, for Victoria Nuland, it is horrible to have to admit the existence of American biolaboratories on the territory of Ukraine, but she had to do that since that was an oath and a matter of her legal responsibility. And it's a similar situation. It's not an interview given to a journalist where you can trick them. That's historical responsibility and the legal responsibility before the law of the U.S. And they just revealed their true intentions. And this time, this bet on the assistance to Armenia by the U.S. in the military area should become an impetus that will provoke another chaos in the region and more anti-Russian actions. We can't be satisfied by the authorities in Yerevan that the latest steps that I have mentioned, the ratification of the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court and anti-Russian contacts with the Kiev's regime and exercises with the U.S. do not affect the relations with Russia. Now, Washington has said that they are affecting it, and taking such steps, Yerevan creates favorable conditions for Brussels and Washington to conduct anti-Russian policy, and we hope that the authorities in Yerevan will realize the dangers of such adventure played by the Westerners, and we hope that these people will make the right decisions for the country and for the region in general. For our part, we reaffirm our commitment to Russian-Armenian alliance and our readiness to increase our multifaceted practical cooperation with Yerevan. Thank you very much. We have one more question. Is it possible? Yes, please. Thank you. Recently, a source in the Azerbaijani government said that the Azerbaijani and Russian authorities are preparing roadmaps which will set out steps to strengthen and intensify bilateral cooperation in the field of tourism. What can you say about the cooperation between Russia and Azerbaijan in this area? What is known about the prospects of holding Russian-Azerbaijani interregional forums this year? The problems of development of bilateral ties in the economy of tourism are considered within the framework of the bilateral intergovernmental Commission on Economic Cooperation, July the 7th this year. The 21st session of the Intergovernmental Commission was successfully held in Moscow. I think we will publish additional report on that. Do we have the voice of Fatherland? Yes, Madam Zakharova. Good afternoon. The question is the following. The U.S. is waging war on our territory, destroying civilians, our cities, and infrastructure. They are trying to create economic collapse for us and to lead us to military defeat. So they view us as enemies. And we still cannot identify the U.S. as an enemy. Why? Will the Russian Foreign Ministry work towards assigning the U.S. enemy status at the legislative level with all the consequences that entails? You know, I don't agree with the wording that begins with, and we are still not. If we are still not, we wouldn't have come up with the list of unfriendly regimes that conduct an anti-Russian policy. It's not just a list as a net and in itself. This list requires retaliatory actions in different areas, in the spheres of economy, the humanitarian area, not to mention the defense. It's a wording that is not just used to calm people down. It's a practical tool of our response to unfriendly and hostile actions in the political, economic, and other fields, not to mention industry, defense. But these areas are the responsibility of our Ministry of Defense. But if you want, we can provide you with additional information on this matter. Or yes, we'll do that. The whole world insists on the observance of international law in the terms of inviolability of borders and territorial integrity of states. The post-war arrangement of borders under international law is well described in the Helsinki Act. For example, in 1991, the inviolability of borders was violated. The inviolability of borders of the USSR was violated when 15 republics illegally left the USSR. Hence, the international ideological, economic, and military occupation of these countries by NATO forces began. We prefer not to notice it, as if it hadn't happened. We do not investigate it and behave as if nothing happened. Why Russia doesn't want to return to the international law, and why doesn't it recognize the inviolability of those boundaries that are enshrined in the international law, Yalta, Potsdam, Helsinki Act? And the previous briefing, you described very well the activity of the so-called junta in the Baltic states. I believe that it's a question that can be given different answers, and in the framework of international law, in the framework of domestic law, and in the framework of somebody's own political and philosophical concepts. Millions of people have thought about it. Some of them have established their political career making judgments on this respect. Some of them have even started to take practical actions in the form of creating political platforms, parties, and so on, based on the ways of thinking that you've mentioned. I believe that dozens of thousands of scientific publications have been made on this regard. And there are differences in legal interpretation among specialists also exist. I don't believe that it is the responsibility of the Russian Foreign Ministry to give an answer to this question. We don't have enough resources or enough time even to begin the discussion of this matter in the framework of our official briefing. The only thing I can do is to recommend interesting literature. But even in the question, you mentioned the possibility to think about it. Millions of people have been thinking about it, but the reality is set forth in the domestic law and confirmed by the international law. I am ready to comment on this part, being an official representative of the Russian MFA. But as for the rest, that's just a food for thought, some material for an analysis and so on. But what is the most important is to avoid the mistakes of the past. Thank you very much. And the last question is from the Media Alliance of Russian Media Alliance российских сообществ. Maria Vladimirovna, the entire Russian diaspora is extremely concerned about the fate of Russian citizens permanently residing in Latvia, whose further stay there has been made dependent on the passing and examination on their knowledge of the local language. Also, the acuteness of the problem has slightly been decreased with the adoption of the decision to extend by 2 years the period during which they must pass the exam. The decision itself has not been cancelled. And some of our compatriots who refused to undergo this humiliating procedure continued to face immediate deportation. And more often, we receive reports from other countries where Russian speakers are subjected to unconcealed pressure bordering on discrimination. In this connection, the question is, how will Russia respond to such facts? Is it ready to receive a large number of compatriots on its territory at the same time? Are structures of reception, accommodation, and systematic support for such migrants being created, taking into account the fact that normally these are elderly people who do not fall under the conditions of the current state program of assistance to the resettlement of compatriots in Russia? I'd like to say that Russia has been monitoring very attentively the developments of the situation with the possible deportation of Russian compatriots from Latvia who become victims of inhumane legislation in Latvia. And you know that these actions are discriminatory and they violate the international legal norms. And as a result, this poorly thought legislative measure has been amended by those who came up with it. And the Parliament of Latvia adopted the amendments according to which the citizens of Russia who failed to pass the exam and who didn't subscribe to take part in this test will be able to have a permanent residential permit for 2 years. And during this time, they will have the opportunity to pass the exam. But as for those Russian compatriots who haven't been able to provide good reasons for their not participation in the exam, will pose a problem. As far as we have found out, the knowledge of the language even is not the most important thing. The local security service has established a list of 8,000 unloyal Russians who, despite the fact of having passed the exam, pose a direct threat to the security of the Republic. And the Ministry of Interior of Latvia decided not to assign the permanent residential status to these people since the 2nd of September. The Department of Citizenship and Migration of the Ministry of Interior in Latvia has already signed letters to these Russian compatriots requesting them to leave the territory within 3 months. So they have gained a lot of experience in creating unbearable conditions for Russian citizens. That's dictatorship. The Russian embassy in Riga monitors every day the situation and within its mandate provides our compatriots with the necessary consular and legal assistance. All the cases of discriminations towards our citizens are recorded. Moreover, Russia is making a lot of efforts to attract the attention of the international community to these inhumane and dictatorial requests imposed on our citizens, and this subject has been commented on numerous occasions by Russian diplomats. We continue to monitor the developments, and we are ready to prevent the catastrophic developments in the future. And obviously, we will analyze this subject, and the law enforcement agencies of Russia will analyze this matter as closely as possible. Do you have more questions? If there are no more questions, then let me say goodbye. Wish you well-being, and I'll see you at the next briefing. Prepare your questions, and I will take them. Thank you. I wish you productive work.